Well, there is much to discuss about U.S. border security. Let's bring in our panel. Here with us in the studio is Eleanor Clift. She's a political analyst for the Daily Beast and a veteran in coverage of the U.S. politics. Also with us is Joe Madison. He's a radio talk show host with Sirius XM's Urban View channel and longtime civil rights activist. Maria Perez is an associate director at the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center in Washington, D.C. And John Sedelides is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Eleanor, this declaration of a national emergency, it's been used 58 times since the law was passed in 1976. Some of it still in effect. Iranian sanctions, that's still in effect. The 9/11 emergency, still in effect. What's different this time?
What's different this time is that the emergency is not obvious. And in fact, there's lots of evidence to show that there is no emergency at the border. And the president, in his press conference in the Rose Garden, basically said, I didn't have to do this, which is, he's making the argument against himself. And this is really an end run around Congress to get money that the Congress refuses to appropriate. And that's a Democratic-led House and a Republican-led Senate. And in the first 2 years of this presidency, there was no money appropriated, at least on the scale that this president wants for the wall. So the expectation is this will be challenged in the courts, and also that the Democratic-led House is likely to pass a resolution of disapproval, which the Senate would then be forced to take up. And the president could then veto that, and they would only need majorities in the House and the Senate, but it would take 2/3 to override it. So the congressional route, he's likely to succeed there. Just want to point out that the act that he's using was passed as part of the Watergate reforms to curb executive power. And here it is having the reverse. It has been used responsibly, the 50 some odd times that you cited.
Right.
President Obama used it when we had a swine flu outbreak to ease regulations under Medicare and Medicaid so people could get treated at clinics. So totally uncontroversial. And he also used it in the Flint water crisis when the governor asked him to. So we've never had a truly controversial use of these powers.
John, of course, there's been opposition to this, opposition coming from the Democrats, the Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, as well as the Democratic Minority Leader in the U.S. Senate, Charles Schumer. They've called the president's declaration unlawful. And I'm going to read to you a little bit of the statement they released. They said, this is plainly a power grab by a disappointed president who's gone outside the bounds of the law to try to get what he failed to achieve in the constitutional legislative process. They're saying he broke the law.
And they have every right to say that. This is not only a policy debate but there's a major political battle going on here. And I think we see crystallized bases on both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And we know that President Trump, if there's anything that his supporters and his critics will agree on, it's that he does try to accomplish his goals and to fulfill his promises. This is probably promise number one to his voter base in 2016. And if he's determined to win re-election in 2020, he's got to be able to show his voters, his supporters, and those people that didn't vote for him but are concerned about illegal immigration, that he's doing everything that he believes he is legally able to do. Whether he violated the Constitution is a legal debate. It'll play out in the courts. We'll see how this plays out in the weeks ahead. But this is both policy and politics, raw, bare knuckles.
But John, to Eleanor's point that when you invoke this legislation, there has to be a condition met, that condition being there has to be a crisis.
Well, that's debatable also. I mean, we have a national emergency, one of the 31 that are still active of the 58 or so that you mentioned were enacted after 1976. One of them involves sanctioning ethnic Albanians in Western Macedonia. Most of this involves sanctions against countries such as Sudan, Yemen, Belarus, and the like. There have been a few that have been specifically policy related, involving cyber. You mentioned before swine flu, Eleanor. Right. Also narco trafficking and the like. But the vast majority involved sanctions that didn't involve national emergencies, but just gave the president, under his executive authority, the ability to use additional powers in order to be able to isolate and sanction individuals that he believes are a threat to the national interest.
All right, let me bring in Maria Perez. Maria, President Trump says there is a national crisis at the border, that undocumented immigrants, rapists, in his words, are invading the country, that drugs are coming in across the border. You've done a lot of work on this. Is there a crisis at the border?
Thank you, Anand. Thank you for having me on your show. What is happening at the border is nothing new. The numbers of unauthorized migrants crossing have actually gone down, as we heard in the opening remarks. It's the lowest number since 1971. And really, there is a crisis. I'm not going to argue with that. But the crisis is not what President Trump is making it seem. There's a crisis in Central America's Northern Triangle. It's referred to as the most murderous corner in Latin America. Homicide rates are really high, one of the world's highest. Impunity rates are really high. There's a crisis going on. It's not what President Trump wants to make it seem. And we see the numbers of unauthorized migrants coming down, actually. To your point about drugs, rapists, criminals, gangs, we see that drugs, El Chapo was just convicted a few days ago. He was found guilty on all counts. And his associates are saying that they said that most of their drugs came in through legal ports of entry, not through the border, the open borders. So it really is, the logic of a wall is questionable.
Joe, what do you make of the president's action? Supporters say he has every right to do it. It's legal. Those who oppose him say it's an abuse of power.
Well, it's, as I think we've all agreed, we'll see if it's legal. Because I think what people need to understand is the number one reason that he is doing it is because he can't get what he wants negotiated through Congress. And that's not how you use this Emergency Power Act. I mean, the other thing I wanted to throw in was the former President Barack Obama also declared it when we had an Ebola crisis. And that's what it usually is used for. Now, the question is it legal? I think that President Trump has already indicated, as he did earlier, he probably realizes he's going to lose in the lower courts. He's said as much today. So he's hanging the legal question really on what he thinks is his Supreme Court. But the reality is, if I were writing a legal brief, the first line that I would put in my legal brief is him saying, blurting out, I didn't need to do this, which then speaks to the fact, then why do you call it an emergency? Because emergencies are what you need to do, not what is politically expedient. I also find it interesting that he's taking on even his Republican critics who supported him in his campaign, the Ann Coulters, who he said now is off the plantation. And she thinks that his supporters are being had. I happen to agree. I think this is just a question of, let me add one other thing. There's going to be a congressional fight, because when you take money, especially from military projects, you're taking them out of individual districts. And if there's something that members of Congress protect, it's their military budgets in their individual districts. That's where we should keep our eye.
Go ahead, John.
I think there's a major issue here regarding incentives, Anand, and just the way we see that there are tens of billions of dollars to be made in illicit profits by transporting drugs into the United States because of the demand by Americans for illegal drugs. You have this incredible demand, well, I shouldn't say demand, but this availability for opportunity for all of these people, as your colleague mentioned, and the woman from the Atlantic Council, the panelist, that we have a horrific situation in Central America. And we haven't been able to work with our Central American partners, with Mexico, with Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, for that matter, to try to see what can be done to try to bring about some modicum of civil society, of economic opportunity, of safety, and a very severe law enforcement to destroy the gangs that have essentially taken over those countries, sending streaming migrants in our direction.
But most of these people, to be quite candid, and this is where I really have a problem, demonizing the vast, vast majority of people who are seeking asylum.
Right.
That's what the vast majority of these folks are doing. And by the way, it's gone from one point, I forget what the millions have been, to now where it's something, last I read, was around 400,000.
Right.
But most of these are
Anna,
people
can I jump
seeking
in?
asylum.
Yeah,
Well,
well, I'll get to you, Maria. Go ahead, Eleanor.
A couple of points. First of all, under the Obama administration, there were a number of programs in the Central American countries of giving them aid, and there was an attempt to set up a way station in Costa Rica so people wouldn't have to make the long, dangerous trek.
Yeah.
President Trump ended all of those programs and has basically threatened to end all U.S. aid to these countries. So he has not attempted to get at the root of the problem of all of these crossings.
Right.
Second, what we have here is really a constitutional conflict because the Congress has the power of the purse, specifically the House, according to the Constitution, Article 1. And so if a president can just invoke a state of emergency in order to raid other parts of the budget for money that's already been appropriated for something else, I mean, that really does set up a confrontation, that constitutional confrontation, which is why it's going to head to the courts.
But does this also tell us, Eleanor, that if we see how events have unfolded here, that there is a weakness in the system of checks and balances here?
No, I don't know that there's a weakness. I think I think the courts are now going to have to step in.
Yeah.
We've had conflicts between the executive branch and the legislative branch before, but the nature of the immigration across the border has changed. These are now dominantly women and children, and the humanitarian crisis could be handled with more immigration judges, with better facilities to care for children. Instead, the policies of this administration, they've separated families and children. There are apparently more than 1,000 children whose parents are now unaccounted for.
Right.
These are policy decisions. You know, this should not be a constitutional fight.
Maria, I know you want to say something, but I'll ask you this question here. Hasn't Mexico actually been doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the United States? It's been sending people back to their home countries on its southern border.
Yeah, one point that I wanted to make is that both Joe and Eleanor are right that the face of these migrants has changed. It's a lot of families, a lot of women, a lot of children, whereas before you had a lot of men who were coming up here for work. And so, you know, getting this issue right is crucial for the long-term prosperity and security of the United States and Central America. Long-term prosperity of Central America is crucial for the United States. Mexico just had a new president inaugurated on December 1st. This new administration has implemented, they want to help the migrants. Their approach to this issue is that we need to integrate with Central America, and President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is from southern Mexico, so he's really focused on southern Mexico development, and he sees Central Americans as a way to boost growth in that region. And so they've implemented a series of policies and programs. One of them, the Stay in Mexico program, which gives migrants who present themselves to the authorities and they say, I'm here, I don't have papers, and they give them a wristband, they give them shelter, work, up to a year. So those are some of the policies that we're seeing. We're seeing Mexico step up and really, this is not a problem of the United States. The problem of migration is not, it's a regional problem. Right. And so Mexico is really stepping in and stepping up their game. Yeah.
You know, I want to say the hypocrisy here is so incredible because, I mean, it makes it so obviously the president is using this as a political issue. He has these resorts, these Trump resorts, and they have openly employed people who were here illegally. In fact, I think it was the Washington Post did this exhaustive survey of a town in Costa Rica, which is peopled by folks who've worked for Trump and have gone back. I mean, he's actually done a lot of good work for these people. So to suddenly scapegoat these people when you have employers in this country have had this arrangement for many, many decades where they benefit from this labor that they don't have to pay as much. And we need to acknowledge that as we go forward with this program.
John, let's listen to part of what the president said at the White House in the Rose Garden today. Let's watch this.
We will have a national emergency. and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there, and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
He's depending on the Supreme Court to
Well,
resolve
but
this.
it's not just him. I mean, I think he's getting legal counsel from some of the top minds in Washington that believe that ultimately this is a matter of the president's executive authority under the Constitution, and that the president and the executive branch are ultimately responsible for controlling borders and for immigration policy. Eleanor brought up a very important point earlier about the power of the purse, and I think that's going to be a very interesting checks and balances argument. The president clearly has the constitutional authority to protect our sovereign borders, but the Congress decides how money is going to be spent. That's going to be a very interesting confrontation if it ever makes it to the Supreme Court.
But, you know, I laugh because presidents don't get to choose what circuit court it goes into. I mean, you know, it's just the, and then he's already anticipating what they will do. And then, in essence, telling the American people in the world, but that's all right, wait till we get the Supreme Court, I've got that.
Yeah.
And, you know, look, and let's also deal with, you know, what's the 800-pound gorilla that's in the room. The reality is, this wall, this is an ancient, isn't this China television? You've got a hell of a wall in China.
Great wall, yeah.
And it can't keep anybody out in the 21st century. And as someone said to me on my show this morning, you can build an 11-foot wall. Somebody's going to erect a 12-foot ladder. Yeah. Let's just get serious. And that's what the conference committee was trying to do. There are all kinds of ways to protect our border. And I think everybody in this room agrees. We want our borders protected.
Yeah.
No ifs, ands, buts about that.
Okay. Eleanor, I think you pointed out in one of the pieces you wrote on your website, The Daily Beast, that the president is chasing unicorns here, that this wall will actually never be built.
No. He has conjured up the image of a wall from sea to shining sea, when in fact there are pieces of a wall. There are some places where there are fences, and there are other barriers, but he would run into, or you can't build a wall some places because of natural habitat that you would destroy. You would have to take people's property, and they have the right to go to court. So this will never be built, and it is a symbol. And I look at it, it's the 21st symbol of the Confederate flag or Confederate monuments that he is, you know, putting out there, and it's dividing people, and it's become very important to a certain segment of the public, and other people don't think it's necessary. And he apparently thinks that he can ride his way to re-election on this issue because he got elected on this issue. I mean, I hope he's wrong, but I think that's his belief.
John, I will get to you. I just want to bring Maria in. Maria, the president says this wall is going to stop undocumented immigrants coming into the United States. Will it?
Like Joe was saying, you know, you build an 11-foot wall, somebody's going to find a way to build a 12-foot ladder. And the other point that I want to make is that part of my job is trying to convey the message that the situation in these countries is so bad. To leave or not to leave is an existential question. These people aren't choosing to come to the United States in most of the cases. They're being forced to leave their countries. And if you build a wall, people will build tunnels. That's not what you need. You need technology. There are other ways to better monitor the border.
Okay, John, go ahead.
We're spending a lot of time talking about the wall, but this isn't the entire issue, right? The entire issue is how do you put together an immigration policy that protects our borders, gives us a sense of control as to who is coming in and who is not for safety and security purposes, but also making sure that we can provide the kind of support for our neighbors that we don't have the incentives that drive people out of their communities, out of their countries, coming to seek the safety and economic opportunity of the United States. And I would add one more thing, Anand. We don't know what's going to be happening in Venezuela in the next 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. If that country implodes and becomes a failed state, There are already 1 million Venezuelans who fled to neighboring countries such as Colombia, Peru, and the like. What happens if there's another 1, 2, or 3 million that stream up Central America towards the United States? A crisis today may actually become an emergency in the near future.
All right, John, you say this is about, well, the nuts and bolts of controlling immigrants coming into this country, but is it about that, or is this about the 2020 election?
All of these come together. Right? I mean, we live in a democratic nation here, so we're arguing about policy issues that have political consequences. I mean, if I watch him from a distance, I think President Trump sees that this was a very important issue for him in winning the election in 2016, but I believe that he believes that it needs to be fixed. There's a very healthy debate to be had as to how best we do this, but I don't think it's completely cynical on his part. I think he really believes that there's a serious problem with illegal immigration in the United States. It just so happens that an enormous portion of the population in the United States agrees with him, and an enormous percentage does not. And boy, do we have a very intense debate going on right now.
Joe, the other point about this is the president declares a state of national emergency. What kind of a precedent is he setting? What if there's a future president who says, you know what, I think climate change is a national emergency. I think
again,
gun violence.
I've had people on my show that said, we've got a national emergency with guns.
Guns, right.
I mean, we just unfortunately looked at the Valentine's Day and what happened in Parkland. You're absolutely right, and this is what let's be quite candid. This is exactly what Republican senators, some of his supporters, said could happen. Be very careful, as people used to say. Be careful what you ask for. Yeah. And that could very well happen. But again, let's understand something. He's doing this because he failed at negotiating, getting the money he wanted for the wall. And what he's adding on top of that is we have to be afraid of all these brown people who, by the way, the majority of them are gang members. The majority of them are criminals. Hell no. The majority of them are people who are seeking asylum. And the United States of America has always been a country where if you want asylum, you come and you prove it. But that wall is not going to stop people who seek freedom.
And people are coming through legal ports of entry. Right. They're not sneaking across. I would really question whether Donald Trump has these deep-seated feelings about immigration. First, as I mentioned, he's employed people knowing they were not here legally. And during the campaign, we have learned that he realized that immigration reform was a powerful issue. And one of his aides, to remind him to touch on it as a subject, just wrote wall down, and then he got this big response. And remember, Mexico was supposed to pay for the wall. I mean, that's the campaign promise he's not keeping. So I think we need to keep that in perspective as well.
Maria, the president talks about caravans arriving at the United States border with Mexico. What do we know of the situation there right now?
The situation with the caravans?
Yeah.
So we're going to keep seeing caravans. Caravans, they provide safety in numbers.
Right.
It's the new way to travel. I want to make a point on the seeking asylum, which both Eleanor and Joe have been talking about. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration is making the situation worse for themselves because they're making asylum seekers wait for longer, and so that's not a good incentive. People want to do things the right way when they come here, but 4 out of 5 cases are denied for asylum, and it takes up to years to hear back on your case. So we're talking about policy, like John was saying. If we want to get this issue right, we really need to focus on the policy.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.